Hello and welcome to the 332nd episode of Killafornia Dreaming. I'm your host, Roseanne. Today's episode is different from the usual, but not anything we haven't done before. I was contacted about this case through someone who has been involved in this true crime community, but mainly advocates for missing persons and cold cases, Anthony W. I'll post the links to his social media, blog, Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, Tumblr, etc. All that will be in the show notes. I want to thank Anthony for introducing me to this case and connecting me with the sister of the person who is the topic of today's story, Kathy. I also want to thank Kathy for having the fortitude and the courage to keep searching for answers and for trusting me and my listeners with your story and this tragedy. Kathy and I had a chance to speak for more than 2 hours on the phone as I prepared to create this episode, and we've spoken numerous times since. So while some of the information I have about this case can be found online, talking to Kathy has proven invaluable. She is the one who was the closest person to the person that we are discussing today, and the information that is out there is relatively minimal. Kathy was able to provide her firsthand account of what happened 45 years ago when her big sister went missing. And to me, Kathy is the most important person involved in her sister's disappearance because of how close they were. And while this entire ordeal has taken its toll on Kathy in some ways that I can't even begin to explain, she's never stopped and won't ever stop looking until her time is done in this world. She's here to look for her sister. And I'm really honored and proud to be trusted with her story and that she has allowed me to share it with my listeners. This is episode 332. It's the first of 3 parts, which will all be available at the same time. So if you're gonna binge, you're in luck this time. All the parts are up and ready for you now. This is the 1981 disappearance of Barbara Cotton, part 1. Barbara Louise Cotton, or Barb as we will be calling her from this point forward, entered the world on November 10th, 1965 in Tioga, North Dakota. She was born to parents Louise and John Cotton and was raised as a part of a very large family at a time when big families were not all that unusual in rural communities. In total, Louise and John Cotton had 10 children together. Tragically, however, 2 of those children died either in infancy or shortly after birth. Because of that, you'll often see Barb described in articles, online discussions, and other podcasts as being the 7th of 8 children. Technically, that description is correct, depending on, however, whether someone is counting all of Louise and John's children or only the siblings who survived beyond infancy. Either way, Barb grew up surrounded by brothers and sisters. There was always somebody around, always activity in the home, and like many large families, there were countless relationships, personalities, alliances, disagreements, and family dynamics at play. Now, one of the things that I've learned very quickly while researching this case is that trying to keep track of every member of the Cotton family can feel a little like trying to assemble a 1,000-piece puzzle without a picture on the box. There are a lot of people involved, there are a lot of names to remember, and of course, there are a lot of moving parts. Fortunately for us, we don't need to become experts on every single Cotton sibling in order to understand or try to understand what happened to Barb. While all of her brothers and sisters were, of course, important parts of her life, only a handful of them play significant roles in the story that we're about to tell. So rather than overwhelm all of us, myself included, with a family tree right out of the gate, I'll introduce the siblings who become relevant as they enter the timeline. And whenever I do, I'll make sure to explain exactly who they are, where they fit within the family, and why they're important to understanding this very cold and very frustrating mystery. Because as we will eventually see, the people closest to Barb, particularly certain family members, would become some of the most important voices in the decades-long search for answers about what happened to a 15-year-old girl who simply vanished and was never seen again. The first child born to Louise and John Cotton sadly passed away in infancy, a heartbreaking loss that no doubt left a permanent mark on the family. Following that loss, the oldest surviving child in the Cotton family was John Cotton Jr. He served in the military and later on in law enforcement. And while that may have proven quite useful when something tragic happens in a family, it would turn out that there is only really so much one could do at that time. Sometimes there is that person who is there to help a family navigate a confusing maze that an investigation can create. There are dead ends, unanswered questions, a variety of law enforcement agencies, missing persons reports to search through, and of course, the decades of frustration that gets piled on top of all of that. At times, there was that person that was interested and dedicated and helpful. And sometimes, like what has happened in this case across so many decades, people move on and the case is left for somebody else to inherit. And it isn't always with the same amount of interest and passion that the previous person had. But mostly back then, when this all first happened, the person who appeared to be the main one handling things and providing information and interested in furthering case was the matriarch of the family, Louise Cotton. And ever since then, nothing much has really happened except for the time that has slipped away. A lot of it has slipped away. And as I sit here telling this story, the disappearance of Barbara Cotton has just passed its 45th anniversary on April 11th, 2026. Stop and think about that for a moment. Nearly half a century has passed since this nightmare began for the Cotton family. Generations have come and gone. Children have become parents. Parents have become grandparents. Entire chapters of people's lives have unfolded while one question has remained stubbornly unanswered. What happened to Barb? And despite the passage of all those years, despite the countless theories and rumors, the leads, investigations, interviews, and renewed efforts to find answers, this case remains officially open. Cold, yes. Forgotten? Absolutely not. The mystery of Barb Cotton's disappearance is still very much alive, and there are still people who wake up every single day hoping that somehow, after all of these years, the truth will finally come to light. And now, we are those people. Getting back to the family, following John came Frank Cotton. And Frank is someone you're going to want to remember because he becomes an important figure in this story. As we move forward, there are going to be certain names that come and go, certain people who briefly enter the timeline and then fade into the background. Frank is not going to be one of those people. He is forever woven into this case in ways that make it impossible for us to ignore him. And by the time we reach the end of this episode, I suspect that many of you will have opinions about his role in everything that happened. In fact, that's kind of exactly what I want. As you listen to this story unfold, I want you to form your own conclusions. I want you to think critically about the information, weigh the facts, consider the perspectives of the people involved, and decide for yourself what you believe. And when we get to the end, I want to hear those opinions. Even if you've heard Barb Cotton's case before, even if you listened to this on another podcast and they covered it extensively and thoroughly, and I'm sure did an excellent job, every single one of them. Even if you've spent years following this mystery also, I still want you to listen carefully to what follows in these 3 episodes, because much of what I'm going to share with you comes from a source whose perspective is often missing from discussions about Barb's disappearance. It comes from Kathy. Kathy was the sister closest to Barb in age. The 2 girls shared a bedroom. For a period of their childhood, they shared almost everything else too. They were more than sisters. They were companions. They were friends. They were confidants. They were partners in all the little adventures and experiences that make up childhood. Kathy absolutely adored her older sister, Barb. And from everything Kathy told me, that admiration was not one-sided. Barb loved having her little sister around. Now, anyone who grew up with siblings knows that that's not always the case. Most older brothers and sisters spend at least part of their childhood trying to figure out ways to escape their younger siblings. Younger kids are often viewed as annoying little shadows that won't stop following you around, but Barb wasn't like that. And she didn't just tolerate Kathy tagging along. She wanted Kathy there. And when Barb went places, Kathy often went too. When Barb was having fun, she included her little sister whenever she could. There was a warmth and closeness between them that stands out when you compare it to the relationships among the other children in the family. And as you continue listening, I think you'll begin to understand just how unique that bond really was. You'll understand why Kathy remembers Barb the way that she does. And you'll understand why Barb's disappearance has left such a profound mark on her and her entire life. Her life has never been the same. And you'll understand why it was so important for me to speak directly with Kathy while researching this case above anybody else. Because when you're investigating a mystery that's now more than 45 years old, first-hand perspectives become incredibly valuable if you can still get them. Memories fade, stories change, rumors grow, people pass away. But Kathy isn't simply repeating family folklore or retelling secondhand information that she's heard years later. She's talking about her sister, the sister that she shared a room with, the sister that she looked up to, the sister that she loved. And that perspective gives us something that police reports, newspaper articles, case summaries, and even this or any other podcast out there simply cannot provide. It gives us a glimpse of who Barbara Cotton really was before she became a missing person, before she became this cold case, and before her name became attached to one of North Dakota's most enduring mysteries. As with any long unsolved case, you're going to find no shortage of theories, speculation, opinions, and people who are absolutely convinced that they've figured out what happened. Spend enough time in the true crime world and you'll see all kinds of narratives floating around. Some are thoughtful, some are plausible, some are based on a little more than rumors that have been repeated so many times that they start to sound like facts. But when it comes to Barb Cotton's story, I believe it's incredibly important to remember where the most valuable perspective comes from now. For me, that person is Kathy. And that isn't to say that Kathy has all of the answers. I mean, if she did, this case wouldn't still be unsolved after all these years. However, when it comes to understanding Barb as a person and really understanding the Cotton family dynamics and getting into what life was like inside the Cotton household and being brought back to the events surrounding Barb's disappearance, there is simply nobody whose perspective carries more weight. Kathy was there. She lived it. She didn't learn about Barb through newspaper articles, television specials, internet forums, documentaries, or podcasts. She knew Barb as her sister. They grew up alongside one another. They experienced the joys and struggles, arguments, routines, and everyday moments that make up a family's life. That's a perspective that simply cannot be replicated. It's one thing to study a case from the outside looking in. It's another thing entirely to having lived through it. And that's why throughout this story, you will hear me return to Kathy's recollections again and again. Not because her memories are the only ones that matter, but because they provide something incredibly rare in a case that's this old, a first-hand account from someone who was actually there. Now, Kathy is by no means the only member of the Cotton family who remains involved in the search for answers. Far from it. Over the years, multiple siblings and other family members and friends have played important roles in keeping Barb's name alive, keeping her face out there, pushing for renewed attention, sharing information, speaking with investigators, and refusing to let this case disappear into history. And as we continue making our way through the Cotton family, I'll introduce some of those individuals and explain the parts that they've played in this ongoing search for truth. Because one thing becomes clear when you spend your time talking to any member of the Cotton family. Despite the decades that have passed, despite the heartbreak, despite the frustration and the countless dead ends, there are still people who have never stopped looking, trying to figure out what happened to Barb. And a select few of them are the very people who knew and loved Barb best. Now, getting back to the birth order of the Cotton children. After John and Frank came Dorothy, then Joe, then Ralph, and finally Diane. And this is actually a good place to pause for a moment because Diane is another member of the family who remains actively involved in the ongoing effort to find answers about what happened to Barb. And like Kathy, Diane has spent years carrying the weight of this mystery and trying to keep attention focused on her sister's disappearance. When it comes to Diane, it is important to understand where she fits within the family dynamic because the Cotton family wasn't divided neatly into 8 children all growing up together at the exact same time. There was actually a fairly significant age gap separating the older Cotton children from the younger ones. The first group consisted of the ones that I just named off: John, Frank, Dorothy, Joe, Ralph, and Diane. Diane was the youngest of that older group, and for a while, she enjoyed the distinction of being the baby of the family. Apparently, however, Diane decided that that arrangement wasn't nearly as permanent as everyone else thought it would be. According to family stories, Diane repeatedly pestered her parents about wanting younger brothers and sisters. Whether she was lonely or wanted somebody to play with or simply liked the idea of being a big sister, whatever the case was, Diane apparently made her wishes known often enough that Louise and John eventually obliged. And so the Cotton family grew again. Along came Kent, then Barb, and finally Kathy. Just like that, Diane was no longer the baby of the family 3 times over. Instead, she found herself promoted to the ranks of the older siblings, with 3 younger children that followed behind her. When you look at the family structure, it's almost like there were 2 generations of Cotton children growing up under the same roof. There was the older group, then a very noticeable gap, and then the younger trio of Kent, Barb, and Kathy. That age separation, or years, whatever you would like to refer it to, would naturally create different experiences, different relationships, and different family dynamics among the siblings. Some were already entering into adulthood, while others were still children. Some were leaving the home, while others were just beginning school. And yet, despite those age differences, the family somehow remained together, at least for a time. In today's world, it is not uncommon to encounter blended families, step families, half-siblings, or complex family trees that branch into a dozen different directions. There's absolutely nothing wrong with any of that, of course, but what stands out about the Cotton family is that all of these children were born to the two same parents. And when you really stop to think about that, it's actually pretty remarkable. 10 children in total, 8 surviving into adulthood, all raised by Louise and John Cotton. That's a large family by any standard, and maintaining a household of that size required an enormous amount of work, sacrifice, and perseverance. It also created a family network that would become critically important decades later when Barb disappeared. Because when tragedy struck, it wasn't just one person searching for answers, it was an entire family of brothers and sisters and parents, to an extent, spread across different ages and different stages of life, who all found themselves united in a single question that remains unanswered to this day. What happened to Barbara Cotton? Given the significant age gap between the older Cotton children and the younger ones, it becomes much easier to understand why Barb and Kathy developed such a close relationship. By the time the youngest children came along, the older siblings were already moving into entirely different stages of life. Like I said, some of them were teenagers, some of them were already into adulthood, some were beginning to build lives of their own outside the family home. The age difference alone naturally created a separation in experiences, interest, and day-to-day interactions. Barb and Kathy, on the other hand, were growing up together. They shared the same home at the same time, they shared a bedroom, they shared friends, routines, adventures, secrets, and countless ordinary moments that would become the foundation of a sibling relationship. While the other children were beginning to spread their wings, Barb and Kathy were still immersed in the world of childhood together. That's a big part of why Kathy's perspective is so valuable. She wasn't hearing stories about Barb after the fact. She wasn't getting secondhand updates. She was living alongside Barb every single day. Now, that's not to diminish her sister Diane's role in any way. She has been actively involved in the renewed search for answers as to what happened to their sister. She too has spent decades carrying the same burden and heartbreak as the rest of her family. But when Barb disappeared, Diane was already well into the next chapter of her life, as she had already been married and, by the time Barb disappeared, had 3 children of her own. And while Diane loved her sister deeply, the reality was she wasn't interacting with Barb on a daily basis in the same way Kathy was. Because of her age, because she was a part of that older group of Cotton children, and because she was already establishing her own adult life, she simply wasn't present for many of the everyday details that Kathy witnessed firsthand. That's one of the reasons Kathy's memories become so important as we move through this story. She literally had a front row seat to Barb's life during those final months and weeks. She knew her routines, her habits, her plans, her moods, and her relationships in a way that only someone sharing a bedroom with her could. And when you're trying to understand what happened to a 15-year-old girl who seemingly vanished into thin air, those details matter. When Kathy and I spoke, we covered a lot of ground. And with a family as large as the Cottons, there was certainly no shortage of people, stories, memories, and family dynamics to discuss. We talked about siblings, parents, relationships, and the kind of experiences that only people who grew up together could truly understand. But no matter where the conversation wandered, we always circled back to Barb, because that's really why we're here, and we don't want to forget that. We are trying to understand who Barb Cotton was, and what her life looked like, and perhaps most importantly, what may have happened to her on that spring night in April of 1981, when she seemingly vanished without a trace. And as we talk about possible theories, family relationships, and the circumstances surrounding her disappearance, it seemed the best place to start would be with the patriarch of the family, John Cotton Sr. John was born in 1920 and belonged to what many people call the greatest generation. He came of age during one of the most turbulent periods in modern history, and eventually would serve in World War II. Like countless young men of his era, John Sr. answered the call to service during a time when the world was engulfed in conflict. And I mean, it doesn't seem like much has changed since, right? At some point after the war, John married Louise. Now, by today's standards, their age difference would certainly raise some eyebrows. Louise was approximately 15 years old when they married, while John was about 9 years older than she was. Based on the timeline, they would have tied the knot sometime around 1944. And once they started building a family, they didn't waste much time. Over the next several years, the Cotton household would grow rapidly. Their first surviving child, John Jr., named after his father, of course, was born in 1948, and after that, the babies just kept coming and coming and coming. The Cotton family expanded so quickly that it almost reads like a timeline on fast forward. For years, it seemed as though another child arrived nearly every year. In fact, the spacing between some of the children was so close that at least 2 siblings were born only about 9 months apart. Some of the kids were so close in age that they progressed through school together and spent years sitting in the same classrooms and walking the same hallways. The result was a household bursting at the seams with children. There was always a baby somewhere, always a sibling to watch, always somebody needing attention, always another mouth to feed. And while large families were certainly more common in those days than they seem to be now, or at least you would hope that that's the case, raising that many, and that's not to judge anybody who has large families, it just seems not as practical or as easy as it used to be. Is that a better way of wording that? Well, anyway, raising that many children still required an enormous amount of work, sacrifice, organization, and patience. The Cotton home was, in every sense of the word, a bustling family environment. And it was within that environment that Barb would eventually be born and raised, surrounded by older brothers and sisters, siblings everywhere, strong personalities, family tensions, and all the complicated dynamics that naturally develop when so many people share one home. Understanding that family structure is important because the relationships inside that house would ultimately shape many of the perspectives, memories, and theories that continue to surround Barb's disappearance more than 4.5 decades later. As Kathy and I continued talking about the family, our conversation eventually turned to one of the darkest chapters in the Cotton family's history: the sexual abuse that several of the girls endured at the hands of their father, John Cotton Sr. These are never easy things to discuss. They're painful, deeply personal, and the kind of experiences that leave lasting scars long after the abuse itself has ended. But they're also an important part of understanding the family dynamics that existed within the Cotton household and the trauma that many of the children carried with them into adulthood. What became clear during my conversation with Kathy was that in many ways, this was one of the worst kept secrets in the family. The older siblings knew. The victims, of course, knew. Certain family members knew. Yet, like so many family secrets, it existed in a strange space where people were aware of it without openly talking about it. Meanwhile, the younger children largely remained in the dark. Kent, Barb, Kathy, the younger siblings knew very little, if anything at all, about what happened to the older girls. In fact, some of them would not fully learn the extent of the abuse until decades later, after they had become adults themselves. And tragically, the cycle did not end with the older children. According to family accounts, some of the younger girls, including Barb, would become victims as well. It would be exceedingly difficult to overstate the damage that abuse like this can inflict on a family. Even when it remains hidden, even when it's never openly discussed, it changes people. It shapes relationships, and it creates fear, mistrust, shame, confusion, and emotional wounds that can persist for a lifetime. John Cotton Sr. died in 1978 at the age of 57, and I hesitate to use the word fortunately when discussing anybody's death because death itself is always a complicated subject. But in this particular situation, his passing did accomplish one thing that years of silence, fear, and dysfunction had not. It permanently ended his ability to continue abusing his children, and not just sexually, physical abuse, corporal punishment, and it wasn't just limited to his children. His wife also suffered at his hands, Louise. But when he was gone, his part in the abuse stopped. The damage, of course, did not. And there were people who would continue the cycle. Because while John was gone, the trauma he left behind remained very much alive. His children would and do continue to carry those experiences. They've carried them for years and in some cases decades. The effects of what happened inside that family did not disappear with him in death. They simply became a part of the family history. By the time John died in 1978, he and Louise had already been divorced for several years. From what I've been able to piece together, their divorce was finalized sometime around 1973 when Barb was approximately 7 or 8 years old. Following the divorce, Louise relocated from Tioga to Williston, North Dakota, bringing her 3 youngest children with her, Kent, Barb, and Kathy. Like many single parents trying to start over, Louise wasn't exactly moving into luxury accommodations. At first, the family lived in a place that was simply too small for 4 people. Space was limited, privacy was almost non-existent, and everyone had to make do with what they had. Eventually, though, they moved into a 2-bedroom house that offered at least a little more room to breathe. The living arrangements were straightforward. Kent had 1 bedroom, Barb and Kathy shared the other, and Mom Louise slept in the living room. It wasn't an ideal setup, but it worked. And it was in that house, in those years following the divorce and following the upheaval that had already reshaped the family, that Barb and Kathy's bond grew even stronger. Sharing a room meant sharing daily life. They saw each other when they woke up, when they went to bed, when they fought, when they laughed, when they dreamed about the future, and when they navigated the ordinary challenges of being teenagers. Those years in Williston would become the final ones of Barb's known existence. Because only a few years later, on an April night in 1981, she would disappear, leaving behind a devastated family and a mystery that remains unsolved to this very day. A moment ago, I mentioned that along with John Sr.'s death, his part of the sexual abuse ended. But the end of John Sr.'s abuse did not necessarily mean the end of abuse within the family. And that is one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the story, because according to Kathy and other family members, the damage being caused by John Sr. didn't die with him. Instead, it appears that certain behaviors and patterns were carried forward by his second eldest son, Frank. As difficult as it is to discuss, Kathy described a situation in which Frank allegedly continued victimizing younger members of the family after the divorce and after John Sr. was no longer present in the home. Naturally, one of the questions I had was how Frank even had access to some of his younger siblings. The answer, unfortunately, wasn't all that complicated. Families interact, brothers visit, relatives stop by, older siblings come and go, and in Frank's case, his own life appears to have been fairly unstable. He experienced relationship problems, periods of upheaval, and circumstances that frequently brought him back into contact with family members. Those opportunities, according to the family's account, were enough. What's especially disturbing is that the allegations against Frank are not limited solely to his sisters. Family members describe a pattern of behavior that extended beyond a single victim or a single incident. And sitting here today, decades later, It would be impossible for anyone to accurately quantify the scope of the damage he caused. I don't know how many children Frank may have harmed. I don't know how many lives were permanently altered, and I don't know how many people carried those experiences silently into adulthood. What I do know is that the people who lived through it describe profound trauma, lasting pain, and consequences that extend far beyond childhood. And as uncomfortable as it may be to acknowledge, this is one of those situations where people often repeat the old saying that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Whether that's entirely fair or not, it's difficult to ignore the similarities that family members themselves have pointed out. And this brings us back to why I asked all of you earlier to remember Frank's name. Because Frank is not just another sibling in the Cotton family story. He is someone who occupies a significant place in the discussion surrounding what happened to Barb. Now, I want to be careful with my wording here. I'm not telling you that Frank's involvement has been proven. And I'm not telling you that investigators conclusively established his role. What I am telling you is that after speaking with Kathy, reviewing the information available, and listening to the concerns expressed by those closest to Barb, I personally came away believing that Frank is a critically important figure in this story. More importantly, many of the people who knew Barb, loved Barb, and have spent decades searching for answers seem to feel the same way. That doesn't automatically make them right, but it does make their perspective worth listening to, especially when that perspective comes from people who were actually there. And Frank is not the only member of the Cotton family who Kathy, and now I, believe may have played a much more significant role in Barb's disappearance than anyone has really been wanting to publicly acknowledge or discuss. You may have heard Barb's story before, but chances are you've never heard it told quite like this. As with many cold cases, there are other theories floating around. Some have circulated for years. Some have gained traction online. Some have been repeated often enough that they become part of the case lore. We will talk about those theories as we move forward, but we are also going to talk about a theory that hasn't really been entertained or taken into serious consideration. Well, maybe with the exception of Kathy. But it's an uncomfortable place to go, especially for Kathy. After years of chasing the speculation and the conjecture of every other possibility out there, all of it has led to dead ends. Every direction has taken Kathy nowhere. She feels it's time to stop going down the same path, to stop trying to avoid being uncomfortable, and to not only allow me to tell you what she feels is the closest she can get to what she believes to be the truth, no matter how it makes anybody else feel, because what has gotten lost in the past few years since the resurgence of interest in this case is the fact that this isn't about anyone else. No family members, no former family members, no family members that might be in the periphery or super close to the nucleus of this all. No investigators, no influencers, no podcasters, nobody except for Barb. Barb at times had become a footnote in her own vanishing, while Kathy has been left feeling as if she has to choose what she says and thinks very carefully. That is, if she's even being heard at all. That ends here with this podcast, and hopefully every other to follow as Kathy continues to pursue answers in her own way, on her own terms. If you know, you know. But before we get there, it's important to spend time on the people who knew Barb best and understand why they believe what they believe. Because one thing became clear during my conversations with Kathy. The surviving members of this family, at least some of them, have spent more than 4 decades carrying this loss, asking the same questions, revisiting the same memories, and trying to make sense of what happened. And if we're going to tell Barb's story honestly, then we owe it to the people who loved her to listen carefully to what they have to say. One thing became very clear during my conversations with Kathy. We could have spent days talking about Barb, her family, and all the people connected to this story. There just are so many moving pieces, so many relationships, and so much history packed into the Cotton family that it's almost impossible to cover it all in a single conversation. Every time I asked Kathy a question, it seemed to open the door to another memory, another story, another detail that helped paint a picture of who Barb really was. And that's important because before Barb became a missing person, before she became a cold case, before she became a headline or a mystery, she was a very real person with a distinct personality. When I asked Kathy to describe her sister, one of the things that she emphasized was that Barb was strong-willed. Now that might sound contradictory to some of the things that we're about to discuss, but it really isn't. A person can be independent, a person can be stubborn, a person can know what they want and still not be naturally confrontational. According to Kathy, that was Barb. Barb had opinions. She had determination. She wasn't somebody who simply drifted through life without a mind of her own. But she also wasn't the type of person who eagerly sought conflict or aggressively stood up to people when confronted with uncomfortable situations. And that distinction is important because when our conversation turned towards Frank and the allegations of abuse within the family, Kathy explained something that has stayed with me. She described her own experiences with Frank's exceedingly inappropriate behavior, and honestly, that's putting it mildly. According to Kathy, when Frank attempted to cross boundaries with her reaction was immediate. She was shocked, she was disgusted, and she was horrified by what he was trying to do. And she fought back. She pulled away, she challenged him, she questioned his behavior. She made it clear that what he was doing was wrong. In at least one instance, Kathy even called her boyfriend and asked him to come over because she was so disturbed by the situation. That was Kathy's response. But Kathy doesn't believe Barb would have responded in the same way. And that's not because Kathy viewed her sister as weak. Quite the opposite. It's because different people react differently when confronted with abuse, manipulation, coercion, or predatory behavior. Some people fight, some flee, some freeze, some stay silent. And according to Kathy, she does not believe that Barb would have confronted Frank the way Kathy herself did. What's especially troubling is that none of this was openly discussed within the family at the time. Like many abusive family systems, silence became part of the environment. People suspected things, people sensed things, people carried their concerns. But there were conversations that simply were not happening openly. Now, decades later, Kathy and Diane have both spoken publicly about what they believe, and they believe that there is little doubt that Frank sexually abused Barb. That's their position. That's their belief based on their experiences, their understanding of the family, and what they have learned over the years. It's also important to understand the age difference involved here. Frank and Barb were not close in age. They were full brother and sister, but they were born approximately 16 years apart. 16 years. When Barb disappeared in 1981, she was only 15 years old. Frank, meanwhile, was already well into his 30s. He was not a teenager. He was not a young man still figuring out adulthood. He was a grown adult. He had already been married. He had children of his own. He had lived an entire adult life by that point. And while I can't speak to exactly when this alleged abusive behavior began, family members have expressed their belief that it may have started years earlier, possibly dating back to Frank's own adolescence or young adulthood. Ultimately, those questions we may never fully answer. What we do know is that the allegations surrounding Frank are a significant part of the story, and they form part of the foundation for why certain members of the Cotton family have looked in his direction for answers for so many years. As we continue moving through the timeline, you'll begin to understand why those suspicions developed, why they persisted, and why, more than 4 decades later, Frank's name continues to surface whenever people discuss what may have happened to Barbara Cotton. So one of the things that Kathy told me about Barb was that out of all the kids in the family, Barb was probably the biggest social butterfly. She loved being around her friends, loved having a good time, and like a lot of teenagers, she was interested in all the things that teenagers tend to be interested in. There were friends, parties, boys, and all of the little adventures that come with being young and trying to figure out who you are. According to Kathy, there was probably a little drinking here and there, maybe some marijuana use. Nothing particularly shocking for a teenager in the late 70s and early 80s. And that's really the thing about Barb. By all accounts, she wasn't some reckless troublemaker spiraling out of control. She had a job, she was responsible, she was a good friend, she was a good sister, she had goals and plans for herself. But if you were to ask her mother Louise about Barb, you might have gotten a different answer. Barb and Louise had a complicated relationship. In fact, complicated might be putting it mildly. They butted heads frequently, and from everything I've been able to gather, they seemed to clash more than any other mother-daughter pair in the family. Louise was known for being tough on all of her children. She believed in strict discipline and corporal punishment, and that was often her preferred method of getting her point across. That was simply the environment that the kids grew up in. But while Louise was hard on all of them, Barb seemed to be the one that she struggled with the most. And part of that was probably because Barb wasn't wired to simply fall in line. She had a stubborn streak. When she felt something wasn't fair, she pushed back. When someone tried to control her, she tested boundaries. The harder Louise pushed, the harder Barb seemed to resist. It became a constant tug of war between a strong-willed mother and an equally strong-willed daughter. By the time Barb turned 15, she had had enough. She was tired of living under her mother's roof. She was tired of the rules. She was tired of the arguments. And so, she started making plans. Barb had been working at the country kitchen, earning her own money and quietly putting it aside. Her goal was simple: save enough money to move out and move in with her best friend, who was also named Diane. And just to keep all these Dianes straight from this point forward, I will distinguish between them by referring to Barb's sister as her sister Diane, or Diane her sister, and I will refer to her best friend as her friend Diane. But the important thing here is that Barb wasn't just talking about leaving. She was actively preparing to do it. At the time that she disappeared, Barb had managed to save at least a couple of $1,000s from her job, which was no small accomplishment for a 15-year-old girl. She also had access to Social Security survivor benefits that Louise received on Barb's behalf after the untimely death of her father. Now, for all of the criticism that people might have had of Louise, and there was certainly no shortage of criticism, there is one thing that appears to be true. There is no indication that Louise ever squandered any of Barb's money. The savings Barb had accumulated was still there. The Social Security money intended for Barb appears to have remained available for her. So, if we're looking for one thing that Louise seemed to have gotten right, that may very well be it. She might have been strict. She might have been difficult. She might have had a temper that could make life miserable for her kids at times. But from everything that I've been able to find, she wasn't helping herself to her children's money. In other words, Louise might have whooped your butt 6 ways from Sunday, but she wasn't cleaning out your bank account while she did it. Now, one of the frustrating things about this case is the fact that law enforcement did initially believe that Barb was a runaway, despite numerous things going on in Barb's life that would suggest otherwise. The fact that she didn't take anything with her. None of her personal effects that Barb would have needed were missing. So it would make no sense that Barb left everything behind, including all of her money, which she would need if she decided to leave without telling anyone. And not only did Barb have plans to move in with her friend Diane, that I just mentioned a moment ago, she was also slated to be the maid of honor in Diane's wedding, who was getting married that July. So just 3 months or so after she disappeared, the girls were preparing for what should have been one of the happiest moments in her best friend's life. And Barb was looking forward to it just as much as Diane was. Now, think about that for a moment. There were plans to make, dresses to think about, celebrations to anticipate, and memories yet to be created. But none of it would ever happen, because before Barb's friend Diane could walk down the aisle, before Barb could take her place beside her, something happened. On the night of Saturday, April 11th, 1981, Barbara Cotton failed to come home. And from that point forward, she was never seen again. And just like that, her friend Diane, preparing for a wedding with her best friend, suddenly found herself plunged into a nightmare along with the Cotton family. And Barb's friend Diane herself has said a couple of things that are very important when trying to understand what happened. One of the things is that she does not think that Barb would have ever run away. And the second thing is, and this is very important, she never heard Barb talk about Stacy or him being her boyfriend. Best friends always, almost always tell each other about their boyfriends or crushes. And Barb was no exception. So with that information, I do not believe that Barb had a boyfriend at the time that she went missing. She may have had guy friends, and maybe there were some potential love interests in the periphery. But really, there was nothing official. And that, for me, all but eliminates one of the major, if not the top person of interest in the story. The only person who has ever said that this guy was Barb's boyfriend was her own mom, Louise. And there is no way that I will ever believe that Barb's mom had that information and her best friend Diane didn't. So, what does that add up to? Well, we'll keep going along the timeline and we'll do the math together. So, I first heard Kathy tell a story on a podcast a little less than a year and a half ago as I'm recording this. It immediately stuck with me because it wasn't just a story about two sisters. It was a story about regret, about childhood decisions, about misunderstandings that seem enormous when you're young. And perhaps most painfully of all, it was about a relationship that never got the chance to fully heal before Barbara disappeared. When Kathy and I spoke, she shared the story with me again and gave me some more details and gave me permission to share it with all of you. Up until that point in their lives, and that point being when Barb vanished, Kathy and Barb had been incredibly close. Like I said earlier, as the younger sister, Kathy was often tagging along behind Barb. And while a lot of older siblings might find that annoying, Barb didn't seem to mind at all. In fact, Kathy told me that Barb often welcomed her company. If Barb was going somewhere, there was a good chance that Kathy was coming too. The girls spent countless hours together. They rode their bikes. They explored. They visited friends. They did the kinds of things that kids did in rural North Dakota in the late 70s and early 80s, before cell phones, before social media, and before parents had any realistic way of tracking where their children were every second of the day. And so for a long time, that was Kathy and Barb's routine. Then came the day that changed their relationship forever. At the time, Kathy was around 11 or 12 years old. Barb was roughly 13 or 14. One afternoon, the girls got on their bicycles and headed to a gathering taking place a couple of miles from home. The route there took them across a muddy bridge and past a landfill before eventually reaching a small cluster of about 3 or 4 houses. Now, I just called it a gathering, but let's be real, it was a party. And that party was being held in one of those homes. When they arrived, Barb went inside, and Kathy stayed outside with her bicycle. Eventually, Kathy ventured into the house herself, but almost immediately realized that she was way out of her element. The people there were older. Many appeared to be older teenagers. Some may have even been adults. People were drinking. People were smoking marijuana. The atmosphere wasn't necessarily dangerous, but it wasn't exactly a comfortable environment for an 11 or 12-year-old girl either. And honestly, thinking about it now, I can completely understand why Kathy felt that way. I probably would have too. So she went back outside. She sat with her bicycle and she waited for her sister and waited and waited. But Barb never came back out. As the afternoon wore on and the sun began dropping lower in the sky, the daylight that had seemed endless only hours earlier was starting to disappear. Kathy knew that she needed to get home before dark, so eventually she left, alone. When she got home, Louise immediately asked the obvious question, "Where's Barb?" At first, Kathy tried to play dumb. She claimed that she didn't know, but Louise wasn't buying it. Mothers have a way of knowing when they're being lied to, and Louise knew that there was more to the story, and even Kathy herself has admitted that she's a terrible liar and her mom could catch her very quickly. According to Kathy, she was given a choice: tell the truth or take a beating. Faced with those options, Kathy did what most frightened 11 or 12-year-olds would probably do. She told her mother where Barb was. And for Kathy, that decision would come to haunt her for years. Because once she revealed where that party was being held, Louise loaded Kathy into the car and made her show her exactly where to go to retrieve Barb. When they arrived, Louise stormed into the house. She found Barb. She grabbed her by the hair. She dragged her outside. She threw Barb into the car. She placed her bicycle into the trunk, and she took her home. I asked Kathy what happened afterward, what punishment Barb received, what consequences followed. But Kathy wasn't entirely sure. What she did know was this: something changed that day. Not just between Barb and Louise, but between Barb and Kathy as well. According to Kathy, Barb viewed what happened as the ultimate betrayal. In Barb's eyes, Kathy had chosen to tell on her rather than protect her, rather than endure the punishment herself, rather than keep the secret. Whether that was fair or not is another question entirely. Personally, I don't blame Kathy in the slightest. She was a child, an 11 or 12-year-old girl who was put into an impossible position by adults. And honestly, even if Kathy had chosen differently, even if she had remained silent and accepted the punishment herself, there's no guarantee that the outcome would have been any different. Barb likely would have been discovered eventually anyway, and received equal, if not worse, punishment. But childhood emotions do not operate on logic. They operate on feelings, and Barb felt betrayed. And from that point forward, the relationship between the sisters was never quite the same. They still loved each other. They were still family, but something had fractured. Something had been damaged. And sadly, they never really got the opportunity to repair it. Because before enough time could pass, before adulthood could soften old wounds, before the sisters could gain the perspective that often comes with age, before they could fully find their way back to one another, Barb disappeared. On April 11th, 1981, someone took away that opportunity. Someone took away the years that should have followed, the conversations the girls should have had, the apologies that might have been spoken, the memories that they should have made together. And because of that, Kathy has carried not only the pain of losing her sister, but also the burden of knowing that one of the last major chapters of their relationship ended with distance instead of reconciliation. That's a heavy thing for anyone to carry. And as I listened to Kathy tell this story, I couldn't help but feel the sadness of it all. Because life has a way of convincing us that there will always be more time to fix things, more time to talk, more time to apologize, more time to reconnect. And then sometimes, without warning, that time is gone. My hope is that Kathy has found some measure of peace with what happened. I hope that sharing Barb's story, speaking publicly, working to keep her sister's name alive, and continuing to seek answers has provided at least some comfort along the way. And maybe, just maybe, every interview, every article, every podcast episode, and every effort to uncover the truth helps write a slightly different ending to the story than the one fate handed them. Because if we're being honest, the ending that these sisters deserved was never this one. The ending that they deserved was decades of shared holidays, family gatherings, inside jokes, arguments that turned into laughter, and the opportunity to grow old together. They deserved a lifetime. Instead, they got a mystery. And Kathy has been living with that loss ever since. And Kathy wasn't the only person whose relationship with Barb had changed in the months and years leading up to her disappearance. As I continued researching this case, one of the people I heard interviewed on the excellent Dakota Spotlight podcast was a childhood friend of Barb's named Sandy Evanson. Sandy's perspective interested me because, like Kathy, she had known Barb long before she became the subject of a missing persons case. She knew her as a real person, a neighborhood kid, and a friend. Sandy and Barb had grown up living near one another and spent time together as children. But as often happens, life gradually pulled them in different directions. The girls were in different grades, and once they moved beyond elementary school, those age differences started to matter more. Sandy moved on to middle school and high school first, while Barb was still navigating the grades behind her. New schools brought new friends, new interests emerged, different social circles formed. There wasn't a falling out, there wasn't a fight, there wasn't some dramatic event that ended their friendship. It was simply one of those things that happens so often during adolescence. Life just got busy. Life changed. Life got, lifey. One day you're inseparable from someone, and before you know it, weeks have turned into months, months have turned into years, and you realize that you're no longer a daily part of each other's lives. That doesn't mean the friendship wasn't important, and it certainly doesn't mean that it was forgotten. Because decades later, Sandy still remembers Barb. She still talks about her. And like so many others connected to this case, she still wants answers. She is yet another person who spent more than 40 years carrying around the same unanswered questions. What happened to Barb? Why did she disappear? And where is she? Then, of course, there was Louise. Barb's relationship with her mother, like I said, was complicated. And that's really putting it mildly. Now, estranged might be too strong a word considering Barb was still a teenager living under Louise's roof, but there was undeniable distance between them. There was tension. There was conflict. There was a history of clashing personalities and hurt feelings that had accumulated over the years. And yes, the incident I described earlier, where Louise stormed into a party, grabbed Barb by the hair, and dragged her out in front of everyone, certainly didn't help matters. For a teenage girl, the humiliation alone would have been difficult to forget. But the truth is, that incident didn't create all the problems between Barb and Louise. It merely poured gasoline on a fire that was already burning. Wanting to better understand that dynamic, I asked Kathy what Barb and Louise's relationship had been like before the party incident. Kathy's answer was simple. She described Louise as a hard person. And the second she said that, I knew exactly what she meant. If you have listened to this podcast for any length of time, then you've probably heard me talk about my own mother and some of the challenges that came with that relationship. Kathy's description immediately resonated with me because hard is often the word people use when they're trying to be both honest and charitable at the same time. It's a polite word. It's a diplomatic word. A word that somehow manages to communicate an entire lifetime of difficulty in a single syllable. Some people simply aren't easy to get close to. Some people struggle with affection. Some people struggle with vulnerability. And some people struggle with building the kind of warm, emotionally connected relationships that most children naturally crave from a parent. And sometimes that remains true even when those children are your own. Listening to Kathy describe Louise, I got the sense that Barb wasn't necessarily rebelling against a loving, nurturing mother who occasionally enforced her rules. The picture that emerged was more complicated than that. There were long-standing issues, long-standing frustrations, and a relationship that often felt adversarial rather than supportive. And when you step back and look at the broader picture of Barb's life at the time that she disappeared, a pattern begins to emerge. Kathy and Barb had drifted apart after the party incident. Sandy and Barb had naturally grown apart as childhood friends often do. Barb's sister Diane had moved out and was focused on starting her own adult life. She'd been married and had children, etc. Barb's relationship with Louise was strained. Even many of the older siblings in the Cotton family were no longer regular fixtures in Barb's day-to-day world. So when Barb vanished in April of 1981, several of the people who had once been central figures in her life were no longer as closely connected to her as they had been in past years. That's not unusual. In fact, it's probably pretty normal. But it's also a little heartbreaking, because when someone disappears forever, the people left behind often find themselves looking back at those drifting relationships, those missed opportunities, those years of distance, and are left wondering what they would have done differently if they had known that time was running out. Unfortunately, nobody ever knows that at the time. They just think there's a tomorrow. But for Barb, tomorrow never came. Before we get into Barb's disappearance, it's important to acknowledge that the events surrounding the last night that she was known to have been seen are not entirely clear. The details are, in many respects, frustratingly incomplete. And because of that, I'm going to present the story as accurately and responsibly as I can based on the information available. At the same time, I'm not going to spend a great deal of time chasing every rabbit hole that has emerged around this case over the years. There are currently 3 primary theories regarding what may have happened to Barb, and none of them really sit well with Kathy when it comes to being an explanation for Barb's disappearance. What we have set out to do with this episode is to finally acknowledge what Kathy has felt for a very long time, to be the truth as to what happened to her sister. It's always been a gut feeling that she's had, that she's felt like she's had to keep hidden in the recesses of her mind and in her heart, as she has gone along with the other theories or did what she could to spare the feelings of others. But I think she's reached this point where she just can't keep how she feels to herself anymore. Answers have continued to be elusive anyway, so there really isn't much more to be lost. And the one thing Kathy wants more than anything is to do whatever she can in order to find those answers before she's no longer able to try. This episode would not exist without Kathy. These 3 episodes, I should say. More importantly, this is ultimately her story to tell. I made a promise to Kathy that I would present it in a way that accurately reflects both what she believes happened and the experiences that she has lived with for decades. That commitment is extremely important to me because unfortunately there have been times when Kathy's perspective has been overshadowed, minimized, or lost amid competing narratives. That is also why it's necessary to spend time discussing the family dynamics before getting into the disappearance itself. The theory that Kathy believes most strongly does not exist in a vacuum. It is deeply connected to the people closest to Barb and to the circumstances surrounding their family. Whether people agree with Kathy's conclusions or not, the reality is that she's spent a lifetime living with the consequences of whatever it was that happened to her sister. Kathy is a victim of this tragedy too. The loss of Barb did not only happen to Barb, it happened to the family that she left behind. Any effort to dismiss Kathy's perspective simply because it doesn't fit someone's preferred theory does a disservice not only to Kathy but also to Barb and the siblings who have spent years searching for answers. For that reason, I'm not going to devote significant time to some of the alternative theories that have circulated through YouTube videos, blogs, podcasts, and social media in recent years. My understanding is that Kathy has reached a point where she felt like she needed to step back, refocus on what she genuinely believes happened to her sister, and ensure that her voice does not get drowned out by theories that she simply does not find to be credible. There is a certain sadness in that reality, though. After all these years, there are still more questions than answers. There are still competing narratives, lingering doubts, and a family that continues to live without the certainty that they deserve. So with that in mind, we will begin getting into Barb's disappearance. So to continue listening, jump to part 2 of this series, episode 333, and it will pick it up from right where we left off right here. I want to thank you all so much for listening. Please, as always, take care, be safe, sweet dreams, and I'll see you over in part 2.